Since 2010, Democrats have held every statewide office and held a majority in both houses of the California legislature, leading some commentators to declare the GOP proposals dead on arrival in California. While the state of California has become decidedly more Democratic over the last decade, there are still places like the San Joaquin Valley that continue to be reliably Republican, producing more than its share of Republican leaders and ideas. What are the views of the current Republican state delegation on the key issues confronting California in 2014? And will they lead to a Republican resurgence statewide? We'll talk to three Republican state legislators: Senator Tom Berryhill, who represents the 14th Senate District, Assemblymember Kristin Olsen, who represents the 12th Assembly District, and Assemblymember Frank Bigelow, who represents the 5th Assembly District. California Republicans, a Minority Report.
Additional funding for the Maddy Report made possible by a grant from Paramount Agricultural Companies, growing healthy food for you and your family.
From Fresno, the Maddy Report, with Executive Director of the Maddy Institute, Mark Keppler.
Welcome. Massive infrastructure needs are confronting the state. Despite a Democratic governor and a Democratic majority in both houses, some Republican support is likely going to be necessary to solve these problems. What are the Republicans' concerns, and is there ground for compromise? We're joined by three Republican legislators today: Senator Tom Berryhill, who represents the 14th Senate District, Assemblymember Kristin Olsen, who represents the 12th Assembly District, and Assemblymember Frank Bigelow, who represents the 5th Assembly District. Welcome all of you to the Maddy Report.
Great to be here.
A quick editor's note: Senator Berryhill is a member of the Board of Directors of the nonpartisan Maddy Institute. Well, Senator Berryhill, let me start with you. The governor recently signed several bills to speed up existing money for activities like recycling, conservation, assistance to disadvantaged communities to deal with the drought. You characterize them, however, as, quote, Band-Aids on a shark bite, unquote. Why?
Yes, I did, because it is. And if you're talking about the quote that characterized this as drought relief, it couldn't be further from the truth. This money was going to get to these people anyway. What the governor did was expedite that money, which is a good thing. But make no mistake, true drought relief is water storage as we move forward.
Well, let me ask you about that. There are several water bond proposals that are being considered. There was a 2009 bond measure that's been delayed because it's apparently somewhat unpopular, so they're looking at other avenues. Everyone seems to agree on conservation. Everyone seems to agree on groundwater banking. The sticking point, as you rightly note, is on this issue of surface storage or dams. So the question is, how much money should we allocate toward dams, toward building new dams?
You know, we spent 10 years in getting that 2009 policy done, and it's still good policy. And in that 2009 bond, there was $3 billion for storage. That absolutely needs to be in the new bond. $3 billion in storage and the water rights for our guys in the north.
Assemblymember Olsen, would you support a measure that didn't include any money for a new dam?
I wouldn't, now more than ever, because I think what we're seeing in this devastating drought year is unless we can capture more water in wet years and then store it to provide for families during dry years like we're having this year, we're never going to be able to have a clean, reliable water supply for the entire state of California. So the top priority in any bond proposal that we move forward has to be storage. And $3 billion is, I think, the floor for what the dollar amount needs to be. And it needs to be continuously appropriated so that they don't have to repeatedly come back to the legislature to authorize that every year.
Well, let's talk about that for a second. So first thing is just saying $3 billion. Now, when they talk about some of these dams, one of them Temperance Flat, for example,
right.
Sites Reservoirs, another. My recollection is it's about $1 billion per dam. Is that about right?
You know, the estimates really vary. Estimates are so rough at this point, but it's going to take a significant amount of funding, not only to build Temperance Flats and Sites, but we have existing reservoirs that need some maintenance that could grow larger than they already are at today. And so what we're saying is with $3 billion, we could make a significant investment in being able to capture and store more water for a state of nearly 40 million people. Our current infrastructure plan for water was built on 17 million population.
I hate to ask you this question, but I'm going to ask it anyway.
Yeah.
Do you recall when the last time we built a dam in California?
Oh my
I want to say it's been
goodness.
about 30 or 40 years at least.
At least.
It's been quite a
At
while.
least.
I also want to ask you, before I ask Frank the same question, I did want to ask you about just continuous resolution. Why is that important?
That's important because if the continuous appropriation isn't part of the proposal, then every year that they want to be able to spend the money for storage infrastructure, they would have to get reauthorization from the legislature, which would be just an excuse to never build storage in the state of California. The same problem we've had for the last 4 decades.
Okay, Assemblyman Bigelow, I apologize for calling you Frank. I've known you for a while, so. What are your thoughts on this? I mean, should a bond measure include, I'm assuming you agree with your colleagues that it should include money for water storage. Is that a drop-dead position?
It is for me, and I believe it is for the entire Republican caucus. You know, I sit as vice chair of the Water, Parks, and Recreation Committee, and in sitting in that position, I have a responsibility not only to just the Republicans, but to Democrats and independents and the public as a whole to look at what's best for the people. When we look at the fact that we've had 2 previous water bonds that delivered no new water to the people, and as Kristin Assemblymember Olsen just said, very clearly, we have an infrastructure that was designed to deliver for 17 million people. We have between 38 and 40 million people in the state of California, and they're projecting that number to grow significantly in the next 20 years. If we do not take action today, because recognize that even if we pass this measure today, it will take nearly 10 years to construct the entire infrastructure that we're talking about. Without doing that today and without the funding and the absence of excuse for not having done it previously is deplorable enough. If we don't do it today, just imagine what's going to happen when we continue down the pathway of drought after drought with no water.
Let me ask you this. Who should pay for it?
That should be a combination of the public. It should be the private sector that's benefiting, the recreationalists that are going to benefit from it, and from the environmental community as well.
Any further thoughts, Assemblyman Olsen, on who should pay for it?
Well, the bond proposal would be paid for all taxpayers because it would be a bond that goes to the public for a vote. But when it comes to other infrastructure needs, the water bond isn't going to take care of all the needs. It's just really a portion of what needs to be done. And there are current conversations going forward, and really it's the users that need to pay for the water infrastructure that's being developed. Of
course, you have to define what users are. How would you define water users, Senator Berryhill?
Well, in the case down here in the Fresno area, it's agriculture. But Met's also involved with it, so it also is LA. And my concern is getting affordable water to my ag guys down here. And if we put some structure together that costs them $1,000 an acre foot, and the water that they do get goes to the fish, and this is a lose-lose for everybody.
Okay.
So as we move forward, we need to do something that makes sense and is affordable.
Okay.
For everybody.
Well, up next, we're getting less water from the Delta, so that's meant a boom, rather, for groundwater pumping. Is that a good short or long-term strategy? And is high-speed rail the solution to California's future transportation problems? That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. We're talking with Republican Senator Tom Berryhill and Republican Assembly members Kristin Olsen and Frank Bigelow. Senator Berryhill, I want to ask you about this big infrastructure project that the governor's been pushing, this Twin Tunnels project, moving water from the Delta to residents in Southern California and to farms in the Valley. What are your thoughts on the governor's proposal?
Well, it's an interesting proposal. It's a big proposal, but I think it's a little premature to talk about tunnels at all until we get a storage program out there that gives us water to not only be able to flush the Delta, but to be able to give water when we need it down south. It's very expensive, and again, as we mentioned before, if this water is going to cost my farmers $1,000 an acre foot, it's not, and the water goes to the fish, it's not a very good deal.
You know, there are some people that don't know the cost of water. So what is the average cost of water? When you throw around a figure like $1,000 per acre foot, is that's a high number. What is it normally?
Well, if you're up in Northern California, it used to be, $15 an acre foot, $30 an acre foot, around $30, $35 for us up there now.
Okay.
But the high-end waters down here are around what, $300 or so, Frank? somewhere in there.
Okay. Senator Olsen, are we circling back to dams again when we talk about the Twin Tunnels project, or is this a project that stands on its own? Absolutely
not. I think the Bay Delta Conservation Plan, which is Twin Tunnels, is absolutely illogical. It will cost anywhere between $25 billion and $67 billion. The Chief Deputy Director for the Department of Water Resources actually admitted at a hearing a couple weeks ago that in a drought year like this one, the Twin Tunnels Conveyance Project will not deliver a single additional drop of water to anyone. And it makes absolutely no sense to continue down that path. What we have to focus on is capturing more water through storage and desalination plants so we can create more water. But to take water from one community to give it to another and continue to pit regions against one another when it won't even deliver more water is illogical.
Isn't desalination a fairly expensive process?
It can be, but actually the costs are coming down and down as technology develops. We just had one come online in North San Diego County, and we're optimistic it will be very successful. But it took 26 years to be approved. That is insanity, and we have to start to expedite these projects because in the meantime, families and farmers are in need of water right now.
Do you want to talk about the Twin Tunnels project, or do you want to go on to groundwater banking?
I can't add much more than what Kristin and Tom have really said, but I think it's important for us to recognize when we take a look at Israel, who just completed their final plan for desalinization, they're 100% desalinization now instead of relying on the groundwater that they had, the limited groundwater that they had, and they found it very economical. So I think it's very meritorious of us to entertain that discussion and look at the value.
And we get the Israelis to share their plans. Let's talk about groundwater pumping. Critics have decried, this race to putting up more and more wells, or drilling more and more wells, as this water is lost from the Delta, as a race to the bottom, literally. Should the state regulate or monitor groundwater pumping more than it does currently?
Well, currently, as you know, that's an overlying land user's right. That's their property right, that groundwater's. But as we're facing a drought where there's catastrophic events, series of events that are going to occur, I think we have to take a look at it. What that looks like at the end of the day, I can't tell the public right now. I can't speak to that. But I do have a very concern that we're taking a right away from people who looked forward to that water. Having said that, when we start to look at the groundwater subsidence that's occurring and the land subsidence, it paints a very much large picture for us. We have to take it serious and look at how we're going to handle it.
Senator Olsen, what do you think about this issue of regulating or monitoring groundwater pumping?
Groundwater depletion is becoming a growing concern in many parts of California. But what I would like to see is us move to best practices models. In Stanislaus County, we actually are getting pretty creative at the innovation. We've created a 21-person water team to take a look at groundwater and find out what best practices could we implement. But I think to go into a full-fledged state management role would be short-sighted, and I don't think that's the answer today. But certainly we need to develop best practices that communities across the state can follow, or we're going to not have any groundwater left in certain areas of the state.
They were talking about, I heard a program recently about the stability of the ground, and it's affecting high-speed rail. How do you like that transition?
Wow.
I love that.
I promised I'd talk about high-speed rail. So I wanted to ask you, Senator Berryhill, what are your thoughts on high-speed rail as it's currently structured?
Well, I've got, as I've said in my last campaign, I say it today, I've got some concerns about it. I've got some concerns about the sustainability of that project as we move forward. And again, as far as where I'm coming from, I think if we're going to ask the taxpayers to invest in California, there's no better way and no more sustainable job creator. And I hate to pivot back to water, but I'm going to, because I think if you look at both of those projects, at the end of the day, for the next generation, it's all about water. So where that high-speed rail goes right through our districts, and I get that, but it's expensive. And the true cost of that thing at about $98 billion is a very expensive price tag.
Yeah, budgets are all about priorities, and so up next we're going to talk about a new state problem, kind of a novel problem, what to do with a new surplus of funds. What do the Republicans think? And what are their thoughts on legislative priorities for 2014? That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. We're talking to Republican Senator Tom Berryhill, Republican Assembly members Kristin Olsen and Frank Bigelow. I wanted to talk about the state's finances historically and a point of emphasis for California Republicans. So Senator Berryhill, the state is no longer bleeding that $20 billion deficits that they were seeing year after year. Now the LAO is reporting we're going to see a $6 billion surplus. How much of that should be used to pay down our current debts? How much should go to a rainy day fund? And how much, if anything, should be spent to restore the cuts that occurred during the recession?
Well, I think a little bit of everything, Mark. You know, back in the GOP 5 days, 4 years ago, we created ACA 4, which was a mandatory rainy day fund that was voted upon 2/3 in both houses and agreed to be put in front of the voters. Fast forward to today, and the other side of the aisle has decided to put this off, and then put their own rainy day fund up in front of the voters. And usually what that means is that they're shooting holes in it. And what I don't want to see is just a ticket to spend more money.
You know, it's interesting you say that because, and I haven't looked at the detail, I haven't gotten into the weeds, but I did notice, I read somewhere where they said they want to change the rainy day fund from 5% to 10%. Sounds like they want to make it bigger. But you've got some concerns that the devil's in the details?
Well, the devil's always in the details. And we're concerned usually when they change things like that, they weaken it. And you'd have to see the final language, and which we haven't yet. And 10% is actually a very good number. And it allows us to, when we have real shortages, to not make those cuts that we had to make in the last recession.
Assemblymember Olsen, what do you think we ought to be doing with this surplus?
Well, first of all, we should definitely put more than 1% into a rainy day fund reserve, and the governor's proposing just 1%. If cities and counties had done that over the last few years, they all would have been bankrupt by now. So we need to increase that number. But beyond that, I think we need to pay down the wall of debt and also reinvest in education, both at the K-12 level and the higher education level. If we're going to grow our economy for the long term, we have to fund education at appropriate levels and making sure that our young people are prepared and qualified to find jobs.
So you would spend a portion of that money on education and a portion of it to pay down the debt?
I would.
Assemblymember Bigelow, what would you do with that $6 billion?
Very similar to what Kristin just said, quite honestly. I mean, the advantage of being the last one to answer that question is I get to chime in the way I say, Kristin's really good. Senator Berryhill is absolutely right on. He takes a look, AC4. I mean, why is it we keep changing the plan and saying we got to reinvent the wheel? There was a plan in place on how to put money away and what we should be doing. Why aren't we following that? It just seems like we're changing it. But following back, I would say we need to put a percentage away. I would use 10% as the minimum side of that equation. Then I would take some of that money and start distributing it to those arenas, those areas that we've taken and borrowed money from. Education being number one. Our students are struggling today. Our higher education arenas need more funding. They're at like a third of what they were receiving. Then we start looking at some of the other areas, local government, who we borrowed money from. We have to restore their funding. The list, there's several lists that go on there.
You know, we do want to ask, follow up on what Assemblymember Olsen was saying about education. One of the things that the Democrats are pushing is this universal pre-K. What are your thoughts on that? My recollection was that's going to be about $1 billion price tag to implement that. What are your thoughts on that?
My thoughts differ from several of my colleagues. For me, it really comes down to timing. I think right now we just cannot afford to create a brand new $1 billion program when we haven't even restored the programs that we cut in education and higher education. So I think it's a timing problem. On top of the fact that school districts are already implementing Common Core, the local control funding formula, to add one more thing would be suffocating. Having said that, I believe in the value of early education, and I actually have a bill that I'm co-authoring with Assemblyman Jeff Gorell. We're joint authors in the bill to do a pilot program to implement early education transitional kindergarten programs in 5 school districts across the state, just to see how it would work. Because I think there's value in it if the timing is right and if the resources are available.
We're running out of time in this segment. I wanted to very briefly, just if you could highlight one of your legislative priorities this year quickly around the table, Senator Berryhill.
My priority is all about water.
Okay.
That's what we will be spending all of our time on.
Okay. Assemblymember Olsen?
I'm working on metal theft issues that continue to plague the Valley, but also education, working on bills to try to bring more computer science into a focus at our K-12 and higher education levels so that they're prepared for jobs in the workforce.
And mine is going to be water. Both myself and Minority Leader Connie Conway have introduced a water bond bill that would help streamline and make it less porkish, if you will, and get direct money right onto the ground into construction for projects that will give us real water.
Okay, when we come back, we're going to talk about Republicans' future in California. Democrats currently hold every statewide office and majorities in both houses. What can happen to make California a little more red, or at least purple, in the future? That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. We're talking to Republican Assembly members Frank Bigelow, Kristin Olsen, and Republican Senator Tom Berryhill. Senator Berryhill, I wanted to ask you about Republicans that recently had their annual convention. The theme was to rebuild, renew, and reclaim. So what's it going to take to rebuild California's Republican Party?
Well, obviously we have to expand the tent. And with Jim Brulty being our new chair of the party, we're seeing that. We're seeing a more diversity in all of our candidates, and for both the Assembly and the Senate, and being more inclusive as we move forward. So that's how we're going to expand this party.
You know, Assemblymember Olsen, following up on that, you know, the state is no longer your father's California. It's changed dramatically demographically. More Latinos, et cetera, women, Asian are all playing a larger role in the electorate. What are the Republicans, what should they do to expand their base?
I think a couple things. First of all, we need to be able to demonstrate solution-focused leaders to voters. Voters need to be able to answer the question, what Republicans stand for. Great schools, good jobs, opportunities for all. And then to grow that base, I think we need to go around talking about the fact that we're moms and dads, just like them, sons and daughters, business owners, employees. There are plenty of messages that unite Californians across all boundaries. And those are the types of messages that we need to start focusing on and going into all areas instead of just staying in the comfortable places where Republicans have historically stood.
You know, Assemblyman Bigelow, is it the messenger? Is it the message? How do you reach this new group of voters Republicans are trying to reach?
I think in the past it's been a little bit of all. It's been the messenger, quite honestly, in some cases, where we were less inclusive. We did not talk with people, we talked at people. Today we're seeing folks who are elected who are willing to embrace and talk about the nitty-gritty, get right down to the meat of the issue, and include them, invite them into the room, and say, hey, we all have a responsibility here. What do you think? What do you think? How do you feel about the subject? Reach out and talk to those people and make them feel welcomed.
Well, what about the message? Do you see any vulnerabilities on the Democratic positions on certain issues?
I think
that might appeal to voters?
I think so. I think sometimes what's happening is the pendulum of life. It swings one way and then it swings back too far the other, and eventually it'll come back to the middle. What's happening with the Democrats is just that. They are now swinging too far from their base, and they're losing touch with the people. Maybe similar to what the Republicans did.
You know, I noticed, Assemblymember Olsen, one of your legislative priorities was a bill to not allow transit workers to go on strike. Mm-hmm. Is that an issue that Republicans might use to gain support among middle-class voters?
It could be.
And others that use mass transit?
It certainly could be. I mean, people want government services to be reliable, to be accountable to the people, and there are too many examples where it's fallen short of that goal. So those are the things we need to talk about, but also a huge vulnerability for the Democrats is that we have a failing education system. We're 46th in the nation. Condoleezza Rice recently said at our convention that having access to a top quality education for every child in California is the top civil rights issue of our time, and nothing could be further from the truth. These kids need opportunities, and to have opportunities, they need great schools. And I think that's a winning message for Republicans because those are the things that we like to work on.
Senator Berryhill, do you see a particular message that you think that the Democrats or might be vulnerable on that Republicans might frankly be able to exploit?
Well, I'll tell you that, in my opinion, I think this is the greatest time to be running as a Republican that I've seen since I got elected. And the biggest reason, the biggest single reason is Obamacare. I sit on the Budget Committee, I sit on the Human Resources Committee, and all we've seen is disaster after disaster, and you're seeing there were certain things promised to the American people that just aren't being delivered, and they can't fix this thing by November. And we begged them at budget to if we're going down this road, why don't we take our time and at least try to get it right? They didn't do that. They went boldly forward, and we've seen what we've seen, which is a disaster, and it will get worse before it gets better.
You know, you've talked to a Democrat, they'll say, you know what, actually people are going to end up liking this, it's going to be down to our benefit ultimately. It's going to be interesting to see how that plays out. I do want to ask you, Assemblyman Olsen, I was looking at your legislation, I noticed a lot of bipartisan bills there. You were jointly working on things with Democrats. Is that the wave of the future? Are you the new face of the new Republican, where they're working on a bipartisan basis on a more regular basis?
I sure hope so. I mean, I think Californians by and large want to elect leaders that are willing to work together on hard issues. And there are a whole host of issues where we really can find bipartisan agreement. Those are the things that I like to work on because that's how I think we can best serve Californians. And so you're right, at least half my bills, probably 3/4 of my bills, I'm doing jointly with Democrat members of the aisle because, again, people are tired of the rhetoric. They're tired of nothing getting done in Sacramento and Washington, D.C. So we need to be able to deliver in ways where we can work together.
Yeah, Senator Bigelow, I want to ask you, with the rise of independence and the top two primary system, you think we're going to see a new governing coalition of moderate Republicans and moderate Democrats and independents?
I think certainly we're going, with this new process in place, we're going to see people who are a lot more pragmatic. We're going to see some folks who are more focused on purity of policy and constructive good versus just the rhetoric that's come out in the past. And that's no fault to anybody that's served in the past. It's just the way the system kind of unfolded. But I think the new people coming in are looking at how to collaborate and work cooperatively together.
Okay, well, that's great. Well, I want to thank Assemblymember Frank Bigelow, Assemblymember Kristin Olsen, and Senator Tom Berryhill for joining us. If you want to stay current on state and local politics, you can sign up for our free and award-winning e-newsletter, The Maddy Daily, by logging onto our website at maddyinstitute.org. And now, another perspective.
Leaders in California's Republican Party are working hard to make the GOP relevant again. And indeed, with the Democrats reeling from scandals that have taken out 3 members of the state Senate, declined state voters will be inclined to give Republican candidates a long look for statewide office in the June primary and the November general election. The top GOP candidates for statewide office are Pete Peterson, who is running for Secretary of State, and Fresno Mayor Ashley Swearingen, a state controller candidate who has been endorsed by the Los Angeles Times. Both are centrists who are stressing competency and integrity. The problem for California's GOP, however, remains its Tea Party base. These activists have propelled Assemblymember Tim Donnelly to a substantial polling lead over Republican rival Neil Kashkari in the battle to face Jerry Brown in the governor's race. Donnelly is an extreme right-winger who is campaigning on gun rights and inciting people's fears about illegal immigration. As long as GOP voters rally to candidates such as Donnelly, Republicans will remain a minority in a state as diverse as California. This is Bill McEwen for the Maddy Report.
The views expressed in the Maddy Report are those of the individuals participating in the program and do not necessarily reflect those of the Maddy Institute, the California Channel, Casey, or Valley PBS. If you'd like to share your thoughts about the points and opinions shared in the Maddy Report, visit our website at valleypbs.org/Maddy. This is Mark Keppler for the Maddy Report. Thanks for joining us.